Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. This video briefly introduces the history and culture of the Song Dynasty before we learn about China's most famous woman writer, Li Qingzhao, who lived during this period. First, to review, we have mentioned that the Tang Dynasty declined significantly after the Anlushan Rebellion of the mid-18th century. Even so, the dynasty lasted for another 150 years, until the ending years of the 9th century, when a major peasant rebellion broke out under the leadership of Huang Chao. The Huang Chao rebellion eventually failed, but a number of warlords rose to power, and the Tang royal house practically lost control of the dynasty. Finally, a warlord named Zhu Wen dethroned the last emperor of Tang in 907 and established his own dynasty Liang, officially ending the Tang dynasty that had lasted for almost 300 years since its founding in 618. Chinese history enters a period of political chaos following the fall of Tang. The dynasty established by the general Zhu Wen was quickly overthrown, and other short-lived dynasties and kingdoms founded by warlords rose and fell in rapid succession afterwards. This period of about 5 decades is known as 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, 五代十国, referring to the 5 relatively stable dynasties and 10 coexisting kingdoms occupying various regions. Obviously, this was an extremely volatile period, dominated by bloody palace coup and violent military struggles. Finally, a general named Zhao Kuangyin from the dynasty Northern Zhou took power and founded the Song dynasty in 960. The Song dynasty became another long-lasting dynasty in Chinese history. However, the Song dynasty was constantly under the military threat of non-Han dynasties in the north. First, the Liao dynasty, and later the Jin dynasty, which conquered Liao in 1119. The Song dynasty lost its entire northern territory to Jin dynasty in 1127 and subsisted in the south until the Mongol conquest in 1279. The Mongol royal house established the Yuan dynasty in Chinese history. The first half of Song dynasty, before 1127, came to be known as Northern Song period, and the second half, after the dynasty's loss of the north, is called the Southern Song period. Now back to the beginning of the dynasty. Its founder Zhao Kuangyin had emerged from the chaos of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, and was deeply wary of the expansion of the power of military generals. Therefore, he adopted a policy of promoting the status of civil officials over that of military officers. In fact, during the Song dynasty, the highest commander over the army was often a scholar official who had never spent a day on the battleground. This policy helped stabilize the Song dynasty's internal politics. However, it also led to the dynasty's military vulnerability in the face of the expansion of the nomadic dynasties in the north. Given his policy to promote civil officials, the Song dynasty's founder Zhao Kuangyin further developed the civil examination system passed down from the Tang dynasty. During the Song dynasty, the civil examination system became the predominant institution through which government officials were selected. The class of scholar officials known as Shi Dafu also became the ultimate social elite during the Song dynasty. The spread of the civil examination system certainly enhanced social mobility and enabled many scholars of commoner backgrounds to occupy high office. However, as we have mentioned, this was an institution exclusive to men. Furthermore, the rise of the scholar official class engendered a Confucian revival movement that led to the rise of Neo-Confucianism, the principles of which would become dominant in the Chinese tradition during the next millennium. One major characteristic of Neo-Confucian thinking was its stricter dictates on women's conducts. Now, let's take a closer look at Neo-Confucianism that would dominate Chinese intellectual history for the next 1,000 years, while influencing other East Asian traditions, including Japan and Korea. First of all, though often called Neo-Confucianism in English, the proper Chinese name for this school of Confucian thinking should be Li Xue, the study of the principle, or Dao Xue, the learning of the way. Neo-Confucianism can be regarded as a more metaphysical iteration of Confucianism, in the sense that it asserts that the ritual relations expressing social hierarchy in Confucianism represent a pre-given, quasi-religious order embedded in the universe, that is, Li, the principle, or Dao, the way. Furthermore, Neo-Confucian thinkers emphasize the importance of the individual rather than social institutions as the embodiment of the ultimate truth. In other words, through education and cultivation, one should develop a personal commitment to the way. For this reason, some modern scholars have compared the Neo-Confucian movement to the Protestant movement in European history. Owing to the individual orientation of Neo-Confucian cultivation, proponents of the movement rearranged Confucian canon to render them more conducive to scholarly explorations on ethical and political matters. Prior to the Song Dynasty, Confucianism was taught through a set of archaic texts known as the Five Classics, Wu Jing, and the study of these texts often became a highly textual matter, focusing on deciphering ancient writing. In order to make the Confucian canon more related to individual cultivation, one representative figure of Song Neo-Confucianism, Zhu Xi, conducted a more concise selection of Confucian texts as the core of a Confucian education. These texts include the Analects, 论语, Confucius sayings, 孟子, Mencius, written by the most important Confucian philosopher next to Confucius, Meng Ke from the Warring States period, and 2 chapters from the Book of Rites, 礼记, the Doctrine of the Mean, 中庸, and the Great Learning, 大学. Zhu Xi also wrote copious commentaries on these texts to offer his own readings. This set of texts came to be known as 4 books, 四书. The 4 books selected by Zhu Xi, along with its interpretations, became officially endorsed as the orthodox representation of Confucian learning shortly after Zhu Xi's death. Starting from the late Yuan dynasty during the early 14th century, the 4 books and Zhu Xi's commentaries became the foundation for civil examinations, and remained so throughout the Ming and the Qing dynasties up to the beginning of the 20th century. They were thus the most influential texts during the last 6 centuries of traditional Chinese history. If the shift towards individual cultivation could be regarded as more or less progressive, Neo-Confucian's gender perspective nevertheless promulgated a more conservative trend in terms of women's status. To understand this, let's consider the larger symbolism related to women's status in Confucian thinking. Due to its metaphysical orientation, the Neo-Confucian school recast Confucian human relations as cosmic absolutes. In particular, earlier forms of Confucianism established a code of 5 cardinal relations, 五伦, between the sovereign and the minister, 君臣, father and son, 父子, husband and wife, 夫妻, older and younger brothers, 兄弟, and finally, friends, 朋友. The first three was stressed in particular as the three cardinal guides, according to which the second party in the relation should bear a clearly and unconditionally subordinate role to the first party. In this manner, the wife's subordination to the husband, and in particular her chastity, became the symbolic equivalent to both filial piety and political loyalty. Through the Neo-Confucian configuration, it also became a quasi-religious imperative associated with the ultimate will and the nature of the universe. Any disruption to the code could also be regarded as an unnatural and evil act interrupting the laws of the cosmos. Hence, due to metaphysical claims on female chastity, in Neo-Confucian writing, we could witness statements such as, "It is a trivial matter to starve to death in comparison with the loss of one's chastity, 饿死事小, 失节事大." In comparison to the symbolic offense to the postulated metaphysical order, individual life became insignificant. This development was somewhat ironic if we consider the core value of benevolence, 仁, characterizing Confucianism when it first emerged through the teachings of Confucius. Benevolence, or 仁, is essentially about cherishing human life. Yet now, this fundamental proposition within Confucianism gave way to an abstract order presented as a metaphysical given. And it's also a profound historical irony that the Neo-Confucian scholar officials who postulated a more conservative perspective on women in the name of the cosmic order were enabled by a cultural institution, that is, the institution of civil examinations, that was developed significantly due to the early Tang policy devised by Wu Zetian, a woman emperor who diverged so radically from the subordinate social position ascribed to her gender. At the same time, once again, we should not identify what's written with social reality per se. A number of historians have argued that Song women probably enjoyed more legal rights in events such as property inheritance, remarriage, and divorce than women in other dynasties during Chinese history. Moreover, the Song dynasty was a long period of about 3 centuries. Women's status could vary significantly during different phases across this period. Another notable phenomenon is that female foot binding began to emerge during the Song dynasty. Although foot binding has often been interpreted as representing a moralistic agenda to restrict female mobility, its actual origin came from the pleasure quarters, that is, from courtesan dancers aiming at alluring their male patrons. In this image, we can see an actress from the Southern Song period with bound feet. The initial form of foot binding during the Song dynasty might be a lot more moderate in comparison to what happened in later dynasties. And during the Song dynasty, borrowing this fashion trend from the pleasure quarters, upper-class women began to bind their feet as well. Although the beginning of female foot binding was not precisely owing to moralistic reasons, it does indicate a cultural preference for weaker, more delicate type of female image, in contrast to the more robust female image we see in Tang paintings and artifacts. Modern scholars have speculated that this preference took place since male scholars created a refined image for themselves in contrast to the martial image of man typical in northern nomadic dynasties, which were militarily threatening the Song dynasty throughout its history. In other words, Song male scholars created a more feminized image for themselves to manifest their cultural refinement in contrast to the Han, the Hu, the nomadic ethnicities. In turn, they preferred female images that were even more feminized, more delicate, so that their masculinity could still be expressed through gender distinction. Whereas a more conservative gender ideology came into being during the Song, the dynasty was extremely successful in terms of its economic and commercial developments. Some modern estimates assert that, on average, Song China accounted for about 80% of the global GDP during this time, that is, from the 10th to 12th centuries. Commerce and urban culture flourished during Song China, the capital of which was set in the city of Kaifeng, also known as Bianliang or Bianjing in today's Henan province. Close to the Yellow River, Kaifeng was a port city busy with commercial traffic. Another very important development during the Song dynasty was the spread of the printing technology and the concomitant development of commercial publishing. In part due to the nature of the Chinese script, woodblock printing was the predominant form of printing even after the movable type technology came into place during the 11th century. As a sign of the simultaneous development of commerce and printing during the Song, the world's first paper money came into circulation during this time around the 11th century. To visualize the Song dynasty, the famous handscroll painting entitled The Spring Festival Along the River, 清明上河图, by the Song artist Zhang Duanshu, is our perfect guide. This painting is considered one of the most valuable in Chinese art history. It portrays the myriad details of urban life in the capital city, Kaifeng, and begins with the countryside near Kaifeng. Along the riverway, the painting gradually moves into the Kaifeng city's busy commercial traffic. It reveals with vivid details the life of the urban crowds in the city, as well as the city's many shops selling a large variety of goods. Zooming in, we can see street vendors, fortune-telling, wine shops and silk shops, laborers, a scholar on horseback, accompanied by several servants. Meanwhile, if we look closely, in this painting with hundreds of characters, there's almost no presence of women. In fact, the only women we can identify are those carried in sedans. Interestingly, the painting shows that one woman in the sedan is peeping into the outside world with longing and curiosity. A detail like this one forms a sharp contrast to the many horse-riding female sculptures from the Tang Dynasty, indicating that women's mobility was likely far more restricted during the Song Dynasty, a dynasty that, ironically, generated much more social and economic mobility for men. At the same time, despite its economic prosperity, the Song Dynasty was constantly under the military threat of northern nomadic dynasties. First, the Liao Dynasty, and later the Jurchen Jin Dynasty that replaced Liao. In the year 1126 and 1127, the Jurchen army captured the Song capital Kaifeng and took as their prisoners Emperor Qingzong and his father, the former Emperor Huizong, who had retired from the throne. This event ended the period known as Northern Song, as the entire northern territory came to be occupied by the Zherzhen Jin dynasty. The remaining members of the Song royal house fled to the south and established their capital in today's Hangzhou at the heart of the lower Yanzi region, then called Lin'an. This second half of Song history, known as Southern Song, continued the trends of the Northern Song period in terms of its promotion of the scholar official class, Neo-Confucianism, economic prosperity, as well as military threats coming from the north. Meanwhile, after the Genghis Khan's unification of Mongolian tribes at the beginning of the 13th century, the Mongols quickly rose to be a formidable military force. The Mongol army conquered the Jin dynasty in 1234 and later the Southern Song in 1279. During the 13th century, the Mongol force came to occupy a large proportion of the Eurasian landmass from the eastern shore of China to Eastern Europe, even at one point directly threatening Rome. The Mongol Empire is the largest overland empire in world history. After conquering Southern Song, it established the Yuan dynasty as a part of its overarching Eurasian empire. We'll continue to learn about Chinese history in later lectures. Next, let's focus on the classic literary genre that developed during the Song dynasty, the Song lyric or Song Ci, which is now often mentioned alongside Tang poetry or Tang Shi as the crowning jewels of classical Chinese literature. We'll also learn about the life and work of China's most famous woman poet, Li Qingzhao, who witnessed during her lifetime the fall of the Northern Song.